it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to host Erica. As she says, this is, I think, the one and only advantage of Corona that we've had so far. Erica's the second person from America giving a share in the Yemei Yun, and it really is a wonderful thing. I'd like to dedicate tonight's share in Ilui Nishmat Yaakov Moshe Zal Ben Chana ve'Avram. I want to reassure everybody who asked me, Erica's not going to give the same share that she gave on Jonah in Herzog in the summer, is she? Just to remind everybody that there are so many layers in Sefer Jonah. It's such a rich book that I think that even if Erica tried, she couldn't give the same share twice. And to thank her for joining us, for being with us, for remaining part of Efrat from so far away, and a great friend and colleague to have since the day you hit the ground running in England, after you got married and blew everyone who came to Shiurim away. Erica, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah Jo. And I have to say, I taught so many happy Sunday mornings in the Women's Beit Midrash, and it's really early years. So it's really a special gift to be with Sarah Jo and to thank her and to see some old friends on the screen and to learn with you before Rosh Hashanah. So what I want to do today is I want to look at Jonah's great escape. And we tend to focus on the question of why Jonah left, as opposed to why Jonah wanted to leave. So of course we have a traditional Mefarshim that explain that Jonah left where he was, ran away from the mission that God assigned him, that Akadosh Baruch Hu assigned him, because he didn't want to put Bnei Israel into trouble with the Assyrian Empire, who was a force to be reckoned with at the time, the most powerful army in the ancient Near East. And certainly we can look at that sort of traditional picture, but it's not every day that someone actually runs in the opposite direction. And we do have, and I actually feel quite reassured by this, that when people have leadership roles, there are those who say hineni, what we'll call the articulated yes. There are those who don't articulate a yes. They simply just do what God asks them to do. They act on God's command. And two people who fit in that category are Noach, when he built the Teva. He doesn't say hineni, he just does it. And Abraham, although he says hineni in a text we will read very shortly on Rosh Hashanah, he does not say hineni in Perek Yud Bet when God tells him in Sefer Bereshit to go forth to a land he does not know. So there's a problem when you don't articulate a yes, and that is it's easy to back off of that commitment. And we see in the example of Abraham that only within 10 verses he experiences a famine and he seeks better pastures in Egypt. And the Ramban has some harsh language there. And it's, if you don't actually articulate that yes, sometimes you can back off from it. And we know that we're always given leadership assignments or perhaps fundraising assignments or other things where we go, yeah, I'll do. But we say it in a weak way because we want to please people, but it's not what we really want to do. There's no hineni moment there. And we also have throughout Tanakh, Moshe and Yirmiyahu being classic examples of those who say no to a mission. Now, if the great thing about being Hashem is you get people to yes, but initially it's not as if everyone gives a clear yes to the things that they're assigned, because I think there's a lot to process and a lot of difficulty and challenge that one has to make sure one can handle. We get to Jonah, and Jonah is really the only case we have in Tanakh of someone refusing, but refusing without language, just going in the opposite direction. So I've always been intrigued by those who escape and run away. So what I wanted to share with you are 3 examples outside of a holy text. One will be from Harry Houdini, who's the master escape artist. One will be from a nonfiction work, and one will be a fictional work. And then really turn to Jonah, and specifically to turn to Jonah Bet, which I think is the great understudied chapter of the book of Jonah, that text of his tefillah, to understand how tefillah is in some way reflective, perhaps, of the deepest yearnings of a person And will that in some way give us an inkling of understanding as to why Jonah does what he does? And along the way, we'll look quickly at the destination that Jonah sets for himself and why that was significant. So I'm going to go to a shared screen now. And as I love doing, we're going to begin with a painting. And this particular painting, which I'm sorry, this was the best resolution I could get of it, is done by an artist I particularly favor. He is an English artist in honor of Sarah Joe. He's an English artist who's a bit of a Francophile. So his name is James Tissot, but he changed it to Jacques Tissot. And this painting was probably done in 1888. And I'm going to invite you to unmute and to tell me a little bit of what you noticed. And I'm just going to give you, I'm going to focus this. Hold on. No. Sorry. Stop share. Hold on. I'm going to go back to my screen share. I was just trying to focus it so it took up the whole screen. Yeah, there we go. That's better. And invite you to look at this painting, this depiction, and tell me when you think this takes place in the Sefer. So thoughts, recollections, things that you're noticing about Jonah, his body position, his where his head is turned, his background. This is the audience participation spot. Just saying. If you'd like, you're welcome. Yeah, Liz.
He seems to be on dry land, so it's must be after he's been spat out.
Yeah. So it's just after, it's really the end of Perek Bet. He's just been spat out. And in fact, because you mentioned dry land, you can see, the only little part of dry land you genuinely see is in the bottom right corner. And I want to suggest something that I invite you to think about when we're actually reading this at Mincha of Yom Kippur, is that Jonah says, he confesses in chapter 1 to being a Navi, to having a special relationship with God, the God who is the God over the sea and the Yabasha, right? The Yam and the Yabasha. So this notion of Mayim and Yabasha, I think present two states that are apparent in this book that actually work in the reverse. Usually we tend to think of water as chaotic, as unpredictable, and land as something that is stable. So one could argue that, for example, putting Jonah in a dag gadol, in a great big fish, would actually be a means of stabilizing Jonah, providing some kind of land for him, some landing place for him in the midst of this chaos. But what we actually see is that Jonah seems to feel most at home in the water. And when he touches dry land, that's really the beginning of a lot of his tzarot. A lot of the things that are wrong for him happen not when he is in the water. In fact, if you remember, he sleeps like a baby when he's on that ship. He seems to be able to interact with the sailors in ways that he does not interact at all with the people of Nineveh. He does not speak to one person in Nineveh. He simply makes his short proclamation. And if you've read Elias Bickerman's book, Four Strange Books of the Bible, which of course Jonah is there, he talks about the fact that his prophecy, although perhaps the most successful prophecy of all time, was not something that had the flourish of a Yeshayahu, a Yirmiyahu, or the mystical overtones of transcendence of Yechezkel. That simply wasn't the case here. For Jonah, he feels secure when he's in water. He feels at home when he's in dry land. He doesn't seem to relate to anyone. And the tree that is given and taken away, which we're not going to talk about today, but is a really seminal scene. It was a tree that grew me'al Yonah, and it's as if it was a custom-made tree just for this man, as we know it was. And yet, this is not a place where he finds succor and happiness and comfort. He's protected only marginally by this tree. Any other thoughts on this depiction? I invite you to unmute. He's trying to find his feet. What about that face of his and his arms and his hands?
To your point that he felt more comfortable in water, it looks like he was like spat out, but he's looking back, like he wants to go back. Was
He
like,
wasn't even
no,
a
I don't want to be here. I want to be back there.
Yeah. So thank you, Miriam. You can see his hands almost look like he's in active prayer, but alternatively, they might look like they're an act of resistance. He seems to be resisting what's in front of him. This perhaps wasn't his only his composition alone. Gustave Doré is famous. Gustave Doré, who is famous for his friend for his. A French engraver, is famous for his works on the what he would call the Old and New Testament, has also something similar, but it's a Jonah grasping onto dry land and looking back at the well with almost a sense of loss, that he has lost this mechanism. In fact, there's a fantastic midrash about this dog that is basically his travel guide. He takes Jonah all throughout the undersea world to access places he could not normally access, as if he's almost like a tour guide of some mystical place. And so, in addition to being his savior, he actually, in some way, is his savior and his protector. Once he leaves, we expect that Jonah, through his tefillah, has reconciled himself with his mission and he's ready to carry on. But that's not entirely evident by in this reading. And I just want to ask, if you are not making a comment, to please put yourself on mute again. I think also what you see in terms of an artist's choice, he has placed this figure straight down the canvas. So you can see an entire body shot of him, and he's looking quite vulnerable. He's looking like a vulnerable person. I think that's communicated by the near nakedness, that he's there in his full vulnerability. You imagine he's going to have to brush up a little before he gets to Nineveh. I imagine it might be nice to put on a suit and, brush your hair and maybe attach a little beard, but he doesn't look like what we might imagine a prophet would look like. So let's go.
Erica, can I just
Please.
say, there's something blind. There's something that strikes me as a blindness there. He's really portraying someone who doesn't want to see. If you notice the way his eyes are, and it has a great deal of significance. He doesn't want to look forward. And that we know very well he's in a depressed state, according to the Sefer Jonah. And it's very much an unwillingness to move on. So he literally, his eyes are closed.
Yeah.
His
eyes are kind of half open, but you're right. And he's not looking forward. So
he's not looking forward.
Just made this vow. He's just made this pledge to God that he's going to do what he said he was going to do. But you know how when you tell your mother you're going to do what she wants, but you really don't want to do what she wants? So you don't really take that step. You don't take that step forward. You take it in a parsimonious way. In fact, Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara suggests that Jonah, after the book ends, the only biblical book to end on a question, that God does not appear again to Jonah. In other words, Sheni v'lo shlishi. I gave you 2 honest tries, but I can't force you to do something that you really don't want to do. And that's really what I'm interested in, is what is this about? If this is about Jonah trying to protect Bnei Israel, but that's all in God's hands. And if Kadosh Baruch Hu gives you an assignment and has this master plan for you, then why can't you just submit to it? And I'd like to suggest that there's something that's deeper, a deeper area of resistance that I think very often we don't get to when we read this Sefer. And okay, hold on. We're going to go to see some quotes from people who leave, who are fascinated by escapes. So the first are 2 quotes from Harry Houdini. "No prison can hold me. No hand or leg irons or steel locks can shackle me. No ropes or chains can keep me from my freedom." And I think that's a really interesting perception, because he's not talking about, holding and restraining a magician in a typical way. He's actually suggesting that one of the reasons perhaps that prisons could not hold him is that he always felt this deep freedom of will and volition on his own. In fact, for those of you who have read Anatoly Sharansky's Fear No Evil, or his wonderful second book, Defending Identity, he talks about the fact that his circumstances, which essentially locked him in, were actually a source of great freedom for him, because he intentionally irritated the guards and did things to show them, no matter what you try to do to shackle me, I'm still really free because I'm free inside. And I thought this was a fantastic quote. The greatest escape I ever made was when I left Appleton, Wisconsin. So I guess you could put him in lots of different places, but leaving home for the pursuit of something that excited him, a great adventure, was in some way more important or more impressive than all those stunts that he could do on stage. Next is a book that was made into a movie. I love this book. I have read it multiple times. I'm really intrigued. It's John Krakauer initially wrote an article about a law student at Emory University who, a lover of Tolstoy, who decided to pick up, not take his exams, and go to Alaska, walk to Alaska. And he goes into Alaska with a 5-pound bag of rice and lots of will, and ends up dying in a school bus. So it's a really fascinating study. And Krakauer was interested in why he leaves. And Chris McCandless, who's the protagonist of this is not a fiction work, this is true, wrote a lot of letters, and he wrote a journal. So we have some documentation about his experience. Sort of naively falling in love with this idea of living at one with nature and leaving suburban convention behind. So many people live within unhappy circumstances and yet will not take the initiative to change their situation because they're conditioned to a life of security, conformity, and conservatism, all of which may appear to give one peace of mind. But in reality, nothing is more dangerous to the adventurous spirit within a man than a secure future. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure. The joy of life comes from our encounters with new experiences, and hence there's no greater joy than to have an endlessly changing horizon, for each day to have a new and different sun. And I think we can relate to this, the idea that somehow when our lives are plotted out for us and we're on some kind of treadmill where we work hard, I think school is for many students is a real prison where there's all kinds of expectations that don't unleash their particular curiosity or their particular talents or creativity. And yet they're sort of forced into that and do well there so you can get on to the next place that you also don't really want to be at. And there's not a lot of room for people, unfortunately, to express themselves in that full way. He sends a postcard to a friend. We like companionship, see, but we can't stand to be around people for very long. So we go get ourselves lost, come back for a while, and then get the hell out again. And he documents this journey with his beginning, I now walk into the wild. So we get a sense from both of these that there's some sense of that there is something greater on the horizon. The constant change is really attractive and appealing, and that there's joy that comes with that. Now, of course, his story wasn't very joyous because he was unprepared to take this journey. It was more a literary construct in his mind than an actual real thing that he could accomplish. So now I don't know if you're familiar with Ann Tyler. I'm speaking to you from Silver Spring, Maryland, and she situates all her novels, I believe it's all her novels, in Baltimore, which is about 40 minutes from here, where a number of my children live. So latter of year, she wrote a novel about a family that decides to vacation in Delaware. And the mother, who is obviously vacationing with them, walks off of the beach and walks into a different life. She just basically walks out of her life. Now, I know you're thinking, COVID, the kids have been home, this one is in Bidud, that one is in Bidud. Let me get 40 copies of this book. And you're certainly welcome to read it. It's an intriguing novel, an intriguing setup. And she says, all those years when I was a child longing for it to be my turn, it hadn't ever occurred to me that my turn would be over by and by. So this is a woman, a suburban housewife, who is struggling to figure out who she is. And she has defined herself through others all of her life. And therefore, she needs an opportunity to find some place which is her own, and realizes when she's ready to have that experiment that the world isn't quite ready for her. And sometimes he said, you get to what you thought was the end, and you find it's a whole new beginning. Again, another quote from the book, didn't it often happen, she thought, that aged parents die exactly at the moment when other people, your husband, your adolescent children, have stopped being thrilled to see you coming? So this moment that maybe you're unburdened of one relationship is the way she perceives it, and yet you're actually not really an object of interest to those others. And someone speaks to her, and I think this is where we'll transition to Jonah. Each life is a kind of assignment, I believe. You're given this one assigned slot each time you come to Earth, this little square of experience to work through. So even if your life has been troubled, I believe it's what you're meant to deal with on this particular go-round. Now, of course, it's wonderful when you know the kind of assignment that your life is supposed to be, and you can experiment and deepen your relationship with that assignment, although that is for some people a luxury. So with these thoughts about why someone would run away from the life they had, we're going to see John Gardner. John Gardner wrote a book called Self-Renewal. It's somewhere behind me on my shelves. Let's see if I can have easy access to it. I cannot. And he wrote this book. He was a polymath who was also a minister to a number of presidents. And he writes, human beings have always employed an enormous variety of clever devices for running away from themselves. And the modern world is particularly rich in stratagems. We can keep ourselves so busy, fill our lives with so many diversions, stuff our heads with so much knowledge, involve others with so many people, and cover so much ground that we never have time to probe the fearful and wonderful world within. More often than not, we don't want to know ourselves, don't want to depend on ourselves, don't want to live with ourselves. By middle life, most of us are accomplished fugitives from ourselves. I have thought about this quote 100,000 times. I also think that COVID has presented, I think, a mental health crisis for many people, because spending so much time with ourselves and being rid of the distractions that normally take us away from that kind of thinking have really weighed a lot of people down. And it's been a year of a lot of disappointments. And so this idea that there's all these stratagems for running away from yourself, so that you don't have to find yourself. And I think that's where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is really some way fighting with Jonah for that self-recognition. Stop running away. It's time to confront. And the question is, what self is Jonah confronting? So the first thing I want to do is just quickly talk about why run to Tarshish. This is something I must share. I only recently came to understand, in part writing the book. I always thought Jonah just basically, I don't know why, it's just obvious from the text, but I thought Jonah ran from Gata Hefer, he went down to Yaffo, and he basically took off on the first boat going to anywhere, because if you want to run away from God, I mean, honestly, you're going to get in that escape car and you're just going to go. But that's really not the case. Vahi devar Hashem el Yonah ben Amitan demor, kum lech el Ninveh ha'ir ha'gedola ukra elaha ki alata ra'atam lefanai. Right, so God gives Jonah this assignment. Vayakam Jonah. Jonah does get up, livrach Tarshisha, to run to Tarshish, milifnei Hashem, because he believes that Tarshish is a location that is away from God. V'yired Yaffo, he goes down into Yaffo, v'yimtza onia ba Tarshish. Right, so you could have just said he finds a boat to take him there, but no, Tarshish is mentioned again. The tain schara, and he gives him the fee, and he goes inside it, lavo imahem Tarshisha milifnei Hashem. So, again, the same expression appears here. We have the addition that is mentioned twice in the pasuk, milifnei Hashem. We get it. We get that he's going to Tarshish. Now, when a text has that Leitford in the German, like a special kind of word that repeats itself, it actually begs the reader, pay attention to me, find out something about me. This is an important place in the mindset of Jonah. So Jonah doesn't only want to run away from God, he wants to run towards something. And what that something is, will in some way hinted at by Tarshish. And I have brought a lot of psukim. I think the most significant ones are in Sefer Breshit, in Yud, to understand that Tarshish, and that's reiterated in Divrei Yamim Aleph, that Tarshish actually is an important location that appears where Nineveh appears. All right, so these are very ancient cities. And Jonah is exchanging one ancient city that appears in Breshit Yud for another ancient city that appears in Breshit Yud. And we have a mention of Tarshish in the book of Esther as one of the as one of the seven nobles. We have mention in the Shlomo Melech story that once every 3 years, you can see it right here. Once every 3 years, the Tarshish fleet came in, bearing gold and silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. In other words, Tarshish obviously has this fleet, and as we'll see in Tehillim, the two citations in Tehillim, one of them is we find regularly in Shir Shel Yom, the idea that these Tarshish boats were very seaworthy. And not only were they seaworthy, but there was some kind of mysterious and exotic imports that were brought from there: gold and silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. It almost strikes me as this mythical city that, it seems to be a real city, but the idea that it's very, very far away, and that there seems to be all these wonderful things for barter. And I'm not going to mention all of these, but I'm happy to give my source sheet to Elisa if you'd like to pursue this on your own. But I want to, in specific, I want to look at this last pasuk. I just have it for you in English, in Yeshayahu 66. I will set a sign among them, and I will send some of those who survive to the nations, to Tarshish, to Libyans and Lydians, to Tuval and Greece, and to distant islands that have not heard of my fame or seen my glory. They will proclaim my glory among the nations. So initially we thought, this is a place that's far away, loaded with jewels, and yet it doesn't have God's presence. It was even HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through the mouth of Yeshayahu, says, these places have never heard of me. So if you're a prophet who does not want to do your assignment, you're going to go to a place where you think HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't. People haven't heard of him. It's not going to make a difference. He can reinvent himself there very, very safely. In fact, this is reminiscent of a book by Abe Yehoshua. In English, it's called Friendly Fire. And the central character, Yirmiyahu, which I think is really striking, the name Yirmiyahu, is a person who has experienced gloom and doom, as our Yirmiyahu has. His wife died of cancer, his son died in the Tzava in an act of friendly fire, and he decides to go to the middle of Africa. He wants to disappear from life as he knows it. And he thinks he's paid enough of a price, and he doesn't want all the exhausting aspects of identity fatigue that he sees in Israel. His sister-in-law, Daniela, comes to visit him at Hanukkah. She brings him a box of Hanukkah candles, and this predates the internet, and a stack of Israeli papers. You know that Israelis, they loved Israeli newspapers and couldn't get enough of them. Well, Yirmiyahu takes those, throws them into the fire along with the candles. And of course, then he has to explain himself to his sister-in-law. And he basically says, I was just tired of being there. I'm not interested in all the debates and the questions of identity. And he says, I'm 70 years old. I'm allowed to let go. And there's this sense, is there someplace you can go? Now, it's interesting. For all the things he wants to let go of, he says, there's no history here. There's not old grandmas popping up and suddenly Jewish. There's not any problems here. There's not tribal wars here. But of course, that's not true about Africa. It's not true at all. What he's basically saying is, I want to go someplace where I don't have to deal with it. Whatever people's problems are, they're simply not my problems. Simply not my problems. So I'm wondering, before we continue, if you have any thoughts or observations about this journey to self or away from self, depending on how you look at it. Thoughts? You ready to go to Tarshish? There's a one-way flight. Now Israel flies to everywhere.
Right. Just that you
Could
can
be
never
Abu Dhabi
really,
or something.
you can never really
What?
escape yourself. Just that you can never really escape yourself.
Right. But you understand that for people who really want to escape themselves, they think that they can go somewhere and the self doesn't travel with you.
Right.
Which
Right,
I think Abe Yoshua was trying very hard to understand. And it's something I think we miss when we read the story of Jonah is, we think of it as he tried to escape from his job, as opposed to he tried to escape from himself. There was some part of him that perhaps such deep self-hatred, right? This sense of not being worthy. In fact, even the act of falling asleep, falling asleep in a storm, it's almost losing the basic principle of survival, right? Of self-preservation, which is unique to the human condition, right? Or I should say the animal world, is that we, at our very basest, we aim to survive. Our goal is to survive. Our goal is to preserve ourselves. When you don't have that basic desire, and for those who've done any work, sadly, on suicide, those who take those, mental health problems that are very, very deep, you'll be with someone who cannot see any of their own goodness. I remember in my years in Israel, I used to teach in a number of seminaries. And I remember I had a beautiful student, very, very intelligent. And she looked in the mirror and she hated herself. What she saw was not who she was. It was not who her roommates saw. It was not who her teachers saw. And sadly, she had to go home. We could not, treat her. She needed to be treated at home. But I'll never forget, and this must have happened 25 years ago, I'll never forget some of the conversations I had with her, how someone has such a distorted, like looking in a carnival mirror, and such a distorted view of self, they can't even see their worthiness. And that's, I think, this part of Jonah, which is so hard to understand, because Jonah was extremely successful. And yet, if you don't believe in yourself, even your success, you undermine your success. Why didn't he step in? He goes one day of a 3-day journey into Nineveh, only one day. But in that one day, what he thinks is, I haven't influenced anyone here. And he leaves, right? And it was, even though the king is changing, the people are changing, the animals are wearing sackcloth and ashes, you're going, what? Animals wearing sackcloth and ashes? Just as a side note, because I love the Metzudat David's reading of this, he says, why are animals fasting? The animals have to repent. He says, well, some people are more compassionate on their animals in pain than they are on other human beings. So if they see their own animals suffering, it may precipitate a change, where sadly, if they see other human beings suffering, they don't necessarily think of change. So Jonah is unable to see his own gifts. And in fact, by the end, he gets very, very attached to the kikayon, to this thing that has no permanence, because the things that do have permanence are not things that speak to him. And if you're doing a careful a philological study of Jonah, you see that the term gadol appears in its variations 20 times in a very, very short book. This, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jonah has 48 verses, somewhere around that. Imagine in 48 verses, in 48 psukim, you have this almost like a drumbeat that the world is so big when you see yourself as so small. And even when you accomplish things, you don't have the presence of mind to see what you accomplish. So I want to go back to our screen. Second. And I just wanted to and want to share another possible reading of this from my own book. In choosing Tarshish, Jonah was telling God and confirming to himself that he wanted a material life of wealth and comfort over a life of spiritual service and hardship. By selecting a city of wealth with little spiritual promise, Jonah was in effect telling God he was uninterested in reforming a wayward city. He was interested in cities with gold and silver and precious stones. He could easily lose himself in so shallow a place that represented the opposite of the lifestyle of an Israelite prophet. His location of choice represented in the ancient Near East a place of worldly pleasure and financial success, the ultimate rebellion for Jonah and an insult to God. This is the difference between Jonah going to Vegas. He doesn't go to a city of sin. He goes to I don't know, the city with the biggest mall, right? He wants to lose himself in a world because sinners actually, priests do well in Vegas, right? There are a lot of churches in Vegas because when you're a sinner, you're actually calling yourself a sinner in relation to a standard that you can't achieve, that maybe you'll try again and again as a recidivist to achieve. But that's not this Jonah. Jonah goes to a place of worldly pleasure. This conclusion may force us to ask a different question. What would a rebellion against God look like to an Israelite prophet? Would it be a direct confrontation about God's nature, or an indirect escape to a place that represents the very opposite of what God asked a prophet to be in this world? So the way that we perhaps get a little bit of insight into Jonah is through his tefillah. And in our remaining moments, I want to look at it. And what I want to do is I'm going to just read it to you to get the resonances of the language. And you tell me the sound that you hear most. V'yiman Hashem da'ag gadol livloa et Yonah, v'yihi Yonah b'nei hada'ag, 3 yamim u'shlosha lelot. V'yitzpalel Yonah el Hashem Elohav mimei hada'aga. Vayomer karati matzarali el Hashem v'yaneni mibeten Shaol shiv'ati shamata koli. Teshicheni mitzula belevav yamim v'nahar yisoveveni kol mishparecha v'galecha alai avaru. Vani amarti nigrashti mineged einecha ach osif labit elecha kadshecha afafuni mayim ad nefesh tahom yisoveveni suf chavush leroshi lekitzvei harim yaradati haaretz bericheha ba'adi leolam v'ta'al mishkachat chai Hashem Elohai v'hitatef alai nafshi et Hashem zacharti v'tavo elecha tfilati el heichal kadshecha mishamrim havle shav chazdam ya'azovu v'ani b'kol toda ezbachalach asher nadarti ashlema yeshuata l'Hashem v'yom Hashem ledag v'yakei et Yonah el hayibasha. So anyone thoughts on the sounds of this? Thoughts on the sounds of this?
There's a lot of use of voice, of the idea of calling, of praying, answering, not answering. It's very much on the oral AU, the AUO, no,
Yeah.
AUR, AL, oral, the oral function. And there's a sense of whether or not you hearing or you don't want to hear, the voice is calling out, but it almost is like it's calling out and asking not to hear. There's a very big, I think, like a collision course between the sounds in this, in Jonah's space right now.
Yeah, I like that, a collision course of sounds. Anyone else want to jump in? Other thoughts on this collision course of sounds, this very oral sort of text? Now,
I heard a lot of shh, 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 either because it's just reflecting maybe the sound of the water, or maybe shh, don't talk too loud, don't say anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do that second reading, although I don't know if shh in Hebrew works, but I think that you've got that sense of the water, the shah, the kind of gentle waves hitting again and again, because Jonah discovers himself really through the power of water, and land is a place where his mouth is, if you will, landlocked. He says almost nothing in chapter 1. In fact, again, instead of articulating with an articulated, no, I don't want to do this, in which case God might say, but here's why you should do this, and here's what I'm going to give you to help, just as he does with Moshe and Yirmiyahu, there's notable silence there. He says only a few words in chapter 3, and then in chapter 4, it's almost as if God is like forcing him open by asking him repeatedly different questions. Charalach, are you really, really upset? Are you really upset? And there's almost a sense of pulling teeth. And yet there's this chapter where Jonah speaks and speaks. Now, there are contemporary scholars who see this as some admixture of Psalms, of Tehillim, and that it's kind of was placed into the book at a later date and is not original to the text. And I understand why you would say that, because it's so unusual for Jonah to talk this much. But I think in some way they miss what Jonah is actually saying and why he can only say it here. He's not speaking to other human beings. In some way, I believe it's true that he's talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on one level, but I think he's actually having some conversation with himself that he couldn't have before. Remember, he doesn't throw himself overboard. He's so passive. He asks others to throw him overboard. And when he gets here, he has to reckon with that. And this is his only act of prayer. He could have prayed beforehand, but of course, when we are in distress, that's when a lot of the tefillah comes out. And I think the sound that you hear most is li. Karati, mitzar li, right? Yaneni, right? He's actually having this conversation where he is situating himself. And I think what he's saying is, I've called upon you. Is we don't have him calling. This is our only act of calling. It was if there's something else, we missed it. But something triggers in him being somehow protected. So there's another aspect of this tefillah, which I absolutely love and want to share with you. I think this tefillah actually takes us down into the water. When Jonah is first thrown, it says, "V'tashecheni mitzula b'levav yamim." He's almost like thrown on the surface of the water. Then as he gets deeper, Yisovaveni kol mishparecha, and he calls them God's waves, right? V'galecha. It's your waves, it's your tumult that is putting me in some danger, that is going over me, right? So he's just at the beginning of the water. And let's see what happens. And at that point, when I realized the real possibility of death, I realized what I was not going to see. And I had some hankering, lahabit el heichal kadecha. If I thought I was going to get everything I needed from Tarshish, right? I was going to have the jewels and the gold, and no one would know who God was, and it would milifnei Hashem. It'd be a pleasure. Only now, when I almost lost it, did I realize I don't want to be in a mall forever. I don't want to be in a place that does not know God. I want to be in your heichal. And at that point, he goes deeper. Afafuni ma'im ad nefesh, right? So now he's encircled, right? Tahom yisovaveni suf chavush l'roshi. So he's still somewhere maybe in the midst of the water where the seaweed is encircling his head. Then lekitzvei harim yaradati, right? I was at the bottom of the sea, right? As this is when he's rescued. I don't know if you ever asked that question. When did that fish come? Did the fish, and by the way, if you're looking at paintings, you're getting the wrong impression, because most classical artists who painted this saw Jonah being swallowed by the sea before Jonah actually gets in the water. But that is not what the tefillah says. The tefillah says in order to find yourself, you're going to have to go way down, literally to rock bottom. And that is the point. It says, V'ta'al mishachat chayai. Right? That is the point where you picked me up after the degradation of my life. And I think actually this is Jonah really coming to terms with how degraded his life is. And he realized, when everything came back to me, zacharti, I realized, right? I remembered. Right? Again, getting back to that heichal, I really, that's where I belong. That's where I want my tefillot to go. And he makes this commitment to Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? So, deliverance is the Lord, and it spews him out. I have all of this going on, and I get spat out on dry land. So I'm going to go all the way back up to our picture. And you can see, at least in Tissot's rendering, as the fish is about to swim away, and I think you're right. Maybe his eyes are closed. I saw them as partially open, but it's hard to tell with this resolution, and it does make sense that his eyes would be closed. That in some way he thought all these things, but he resisted nevertheless. And he wasn't quite ready to go back on dry land. And maybe that's why the artist put just a little drop of dry land here, where we could see it. But Jonah hasn't really touched it yet, although his feet are in motion to go to the city as he's trying to, because he just said, I'm gonna do the pledge that I'm just, before he didn't pledge, now I'm gonna pledge and I'm really gonna do it. But his hands and his face tell a very different story. And so I just want to think with you just for a few moments and take some questions and thoughts on this amazing text. I think on the one hand, people can read this and say, this is a story of reconciliation. But honestly, when I look at the language, I don't see it. I see it as someone who is very, very aware of his weaknesses, unaware of his strengths and the influence that he has, the power that he used, but then quickly dissipated because perhaps he couldn't sustain that belief in himself. And I think there's that moment that I think Tissot captures, which we're all feeling at the end of Yom Kippur, which is we're just steeped in our sin, steeped in our wrongdoing, steeped in the reflections on our mistakes. We don't really feel that hardiness, that sense, like everything feels gadol. And we feel small. I don't know about you, I get very cold by the afternoon after a day of fasting, and with air conditioning on in shul, now we'll be davening outside. We'll see how that goes. We'll contend with the mosquitoes as we've been contending the whole summer. But that feeling of the incredibly shrinking person who can't see the lifeline is there, because the lifeline is not in this text really in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying hard. He's asking Jonah all kinds of questions. You can do this. Understand your anger. You can overcome this. But Jonah never feels that way. And I think in some way we read this so that we can be in we understand Jonah's mindset, that the text has really captured the story that is playing out inside of us at Mincha time, but also so that we can see chapter 3 and chapter 2. When Jonah does come in touch with himself, the best of himself wants Heichal Kachecha, wants to be in your holy temple. The best of himself wants to pledge and do it. And we make those pledges, but as a wise man said, it's not how you fast, it's how you break the fast. It's who you'll be when you step out of that great fish that is Yom Kippur that holds us there. Who are we going to be when we take that step out onto dry land? Are we really going to be able to walk into the pledges, to walk into that purpose that we have in life? And that's the question that the text leaves us with, that only we can answer. And I think that's why it's left as a question mark, because this is our own private exploration, and only we know the obstacles that stand in front of us, chief of which is ourselves. And I'll open it up for any questions or thoughts in the remaining few minutes we have.
I think I never identified as strongly with Jonah as we do this year.
Yeah.
The sense of banging your head against a brick wall. Like that's for me, that's Jonah in Perek Bet. That the asuf chavush laroshi, and falling deeper and deeper and deeper into a whirlpool which is sucking you in and down, and trying constantly to look up and not quite see the light. I think that's something that we can identify with right now.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much
and
so.
The question is who's asking the question on the outside now?
I'm glad that you raised that, and I want to share something that's given me a lot of pause this year. As I think about the year, I also want to point out that for a lot of people who wanted that escape, who said, you know what, let's go away for a few days, and you're going, there's nowhere to go to. You can't get away. And so that enforced sense of being with oneself, of being with those we love, and maybe at some moments loving them a little less, but also the opportunity to get to know the self and get to know others, and yet the opportunity is here, and we don't necessarily take advantage of it. So I wanted to share a little story with you that was written, that was one of my kids pointed out on the internet, and I kind of Judaized it. Is a child is speaking to his grandfather far in the future, and he says, Zadie, did you live during the time of COVID? And he says, yes, I did. And he says, you know, Zaidi, I heard it was terrible. I heard thousands of people died all over the world. And I heard there were riots and wildfires and, you know, and people lost jobs. And the Zaidi says, yes, all that's true, but that's not the way I remembered it. I was only young and I got to spend a lot of time at home. And my father taught me to bake, and my parents played games with me. And it was the first time we had family rituals, and we learned to make challah. And my parents joined a shul so that they could be part of a community, because they realized how hard it is to face the world alone. And you're in Jewish day school today because at that point your parents decided to join a shul and get involved. And so the Zaidi says, you know, you're right about COVID, but that's not the way I remember it. And I think that's really a challenge for us this year. That's a different sort of challenge as we approach the Yamim Noraim, is what is the story we were going to tell far into the future of the things that we did accomplish, of the relationships that we really built, of the people we reached out to who are tremendously isolated, people in non-nuclear families, elderly who can't leave their homes. So it's really on us to say, how are we coming out of this? Because it's very easy to be disappointed, as I can tell you. And I think a lot of people are going into this Yom Tov feeling angry at God, not feeling close, feeling angry at the world, and not feeling this is a world I want to throw the best self at this world. And yet this is the time when the world needs us most. It's a tall order, and we understand why Jonah runs, because it's a good time to run. But it's also really, it's a really good time to think. And with that, I will wish you a Shana Tova. Lovely to see you, and wishing you a good year, and mostly a good year of health.
Thank you. Shana Tova.
Thank you.